The fortress of Waitress was carved from winter itself. The ancient black stone corridors held a permanent bone-deep chill that no hearth could ever truly banish, echoing only with the howling of the wind outside the frosted glass. The heavy tapestries lining the walls, depicting ancient battles and legendary lichen kings, did nothing to absorb the freezing drafts that crept beneath the iron doors. But for Evelina Vance, the true danger was never the biting cold of the fortress. It was the heat. It had started on the very first day of her assignment. Mistress Tabitha Geller had given her a heavy silver tray, a steaming porcelain cup, and a grim warning. The royal physicians had failed. Elder Julian Finch, the most esteemed healer in the pack, and a wolf of unparalleled medical knowledge, had exhausted every ancient remedy and blood oath to no avail. King Kenneth Sterling, the terrifying Alpha King of Waitress, was trapped in a cursed slumber, a waking nightmare that was slowly consuming his mind and destroying his inner wolf. He was volatile, unpredictable, and devastatingly lethal even in his sleep. His primal instincts lashed out at anyone who dared enter his domain. Only Evelina, a quiet, seemingly wolfless maid, possessed the strange, calming gravity required to approach the monarch without being violently torn apart. Her daily, low-status chore was simple but deadly. Enter his massive bedchamber at dawn, serve his medicinal tea, and use her quiet presence to soothe his feral, suffering wolf. She remembered the sheer, suffocating terror of that first morning. But terror quickly gave way to a quiet, desperate routine. Beneath the coarse, fraying wool of her servant dress, the lunar solis amulet rested heavily against her collarbone. The ancient silver necklace felt like a block of ice against her chest, working silently and relentlessly to mask the impossibly sweet, potent scent of her hidden sun-born bloodline from the feral senses of the palace guards. If they knew what she truly was, she would not be serving tea. She would be locked in the deepest dungeon as a political prisoner. By the third month of her service, Evelina's sharp senses had uncovered the dark truth. The single steaming porcelain cup of winter rose tea she was ordered to serve was not a cure, it was a cage. Beneath the sharp, bitter scent of the winter rose leaves lay a sickly sweet, cloying undercurrent, a sleeping draught, a slow-acting poison meant to keep his wolf suppressed and his mind trapped in the dark. Supplied, of course, by Lady Cassandra Thorne. From that day on, Evelina had risked her life every single morning. She would stand in the shadows of his bedchamber, hovering her pale fingers over the cup, letting a tiny fraction of her dormant sun-born magic bleed into the dark liquid to purify it before bringing it to his lips. For 119 days, the king had slept. Every single morning, she had watched the dark poison slowly drain from his veins, replaced by the quiet, golden warmth of her magic. She had memorized the harsh lines of his face, the steady rhythm of his heart, and the devastating power that slept beneath his skin. She had become his silent guardian, his secret savior, bound to a man who did not even know her name. Then came day 120. Exactly at 5 a.m., Evelina approached the massive, iron-wrought double doors of the royal bedchamber. The temperature in the corridor began to shift violently. The air grew thick, suffocatingly heavy, radiating a predatory heat that prickled across her exposed skin. She pushed the heavy doors open, the iron hinges groaning softly in the dim morning light. She expected a cavern of suffocating heat and restless shadows. She expected to see the king tangled in dark velvet sheets, fighting the remnants of his fevered dreams. Instead, the bed was empty. Evelina froze. Her hands gripped the edges of the heavy silver tray so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. The ceramic cup rattled softly against the metal. King Kenneth Sterling was standing by the massive frosted window across the room. He was already awake. The Alpha King of Waitress was a terrifying sight. His massive, scarred chest heaved with uneven, jagged breaths, the heavy muscles corded and tense, as if he were holding up the ceiling itself. Scars from 100 forgotten battles crisscrossed his pale skin, a testament to the brutal wars he had fought before the curse took him. The sheer force of his uncontrolled aura was enough to bring a lesser wolf to their knees. It pressed down on the room like a physical weight, making the air taste of ozone, dark magic, and impending violence. He turned his head slowly. The movement was predatory and stiff, as if he were physically fighting the very air around him. shaking off the chains of a 100-day nightmare. His eyes, previously lost to the milky fog of the cursed poison, were now burning, molten gold. They were the eyes of a king who had just realized he was in a cage and was preparing to tear it apart with his bare hands. Silence. The heavy, deafening silence of an apex predator locking onto its prey. Evelina couldn't breathe. The heavy silver tray in her hands trembled. The heat rolling off his skin was immense, smelling of wild ozone, dark pine and raw, unrestrained danger. It was the scent of a storm about to break. Slowly, deliberately, Kenneth took a step toward her. The thick floorboards groaned under his immense weight. The feral growl in his chest hitched, deep and vibrating, a sound that bypassed human hearing and struck directly at the soul. The frantic, erratic beating of his heart echoed in the quiet room, syncing perfectly with her own racing pulse. For a single fleeting second, the bond between them hummed. It was not a metaphor. It was a devastating physical strike, a phantom thread of liquid silver and molten gold snapping into place, pulling at the center of her chest, with the force of a falling star. Her hidden silver pendant burned violently against her collarbone, unable to mask the sheer, undeniable reality of a true fated mate bond recognizing its other half. Kenneth's jaw clenched tight enough to crack bone. His massive hand twitched, reaching out toward her. His fingers curled into half claws. The poison was still fighting him, a dark sludge in his veins, still trying to drag him under into the cursed sleep. But his wolf was entirely, obsessively focused on the frail maid standing by the door. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum, unspoken but absolute, reverberating through her very bones. Mine, Evelina's lips parted. Her sunborn magic rose in a warm, desperate tide to answer his call. She wanted to step forward. She wanted to press her hands against his burning chest and flood his veins with pure, unadulterated healing light. But the years of poison had taken their toll. The sudden, violent exertion of shattering the curse and standing upright was too much for his ravaged body. Kenneth's golden eyes flickered. A jagged gasp tore from his throat. He stumbled forward, gripping the edge of a heavy oak table. His knuckles turned white, his muscles locking in a brutal spasm as the residual venom fought his waking wolf for dominance. Before Evelina could drop the tray and rush to his side, the heavy oak doors exploded inward. The sound cracked through the silent room like a whip. Evelina flinched, pulling her hands back as a rush of freezing air swept into the oppressive heat of the bedchamber. Booted footsteps echoed sharply against the stone. She turned slowly, instantly dropping her gaze to the floor in a practiced, flawless display of submission. Lady Cassandra Thorne stood in the doorway, framed by a dozen heavily armed royal guards. The noblewoman's crimson silk riding habit stood in stark contrast to the dreary greys of the castle, a slash of fresh blood against the winter stone. Her lips were curved into a smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. She strode into the room, the sharp clack of her heels cutting through Kenneth's heavy, labored breathing as he knelt on the floor, fighting to keep his consciousness. "Step away from the king, you filthy little creature." Cassandra's voice was like poisoned honey, dripping with aristocratic disdain and false authority. Evelina did not speak. She stepped backward, folding her hands neatly in front of her coarse apron. She knew exactly what this was. Cassandra had realized that the quiet maid was purifying the tea. The noblewoman had sensed the shift in the pack magic, realizing that Evelina was the only thing keeping the king's soul anchored to his physical body. And now, seeing the king awake but deeply incapacitated, his muscles locking as he fought the remnants of the winter rose tea, Cassandra was seizing her moment before he could fully recover and speak the truth. She needed a scapegoat, and a wolfless maid was the perfect target. "Observe this treachery," Cassandra sneered, sweeping a perfectly manicured, gloved hand toward the silver tray Evelina had just set down. She picked up the porcelain cup, swirling the dark liquid before thrusting it toward the captain of the guard. "Scent the nightshade. Scent the rot. This wolfless rat has been poisoning our sovereign under the guise of serving him. See what she has done. She has driven him to collapse. She is an assassin sent to destroy Valdris." Gasps rippled through the gathered guards. The captain stepped forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of his heavy broadsword. The hostility in the room spiked, a sudden, suffocating wave of killing intent directed entirely at Evelina. The air grew bitterly cold, stripping away the warmth of the king's presence. "Treason," Cassandra declared, her voice rising in theatrical, perfectly rehearsed horror, ensuring every guard in the corridor heard her judgment. "The punishment is death. But because the king is merciful, and because I will not have his chambers stained with peasant blood today, I will simply cast you out. You are exiled from Waitress. If you are found within the pack borders by nightfall, the guards will execute you on sight. Take nothing. Leave now." The accusation was a guaranteed death sentence. The winter storms outside the fortress walls were legendary, capable of freezing a fully shifted Lycan in minutes. For a supposed human maid with no thick fur and no provisions, it was a guarantee of a slow, agonizing demise. The guards waited for the maid to break. They expected tears. They expected her to fall to her knees, to claw at Cassandra's silk skirts, to beg and plead for her miserable life. She didn't know the full extent of the council's corruption. She didn't know what Cassandra was truly planning for the throne once the king was officially declared dead. And she definitely didn't know how Kenneth would survive the next 3 days without her purifying magic to keep the winter rose tea at bay. All she knew was the crushing, hollow ache expanding in her chest as she looked at the struggling monarch one last time. His golden eyes were hazy, locked onto her retreating form. His massive hand reached out blindly, weakly, his lips parting but unable to form the words to stop the guards from taking her. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. Evelina did not shed a single tear. She did not open her mouth to argue, knowing that defending herself without revealing the ancient magic bound by the enchanted necklace was impossible. Instead, she offered a perfectly measured, deeply cold curtsy. The silence in the room became deafening, thick with an unexpected tension as the supposedly weak maid simply turned on her heel. She walked past the heavily armed guards, her footsteps light and even. She left the suffocating heat of the bedchamber, stepping out into the freezing corridor without looking back, carrying a dignity that made the crimson-clad noblewoman look suddenly, inexplicably small. The journey into the freezing forests was a descent into a white, blinding hell. By the time the heavy iron gates of Waitress slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate, the pale morning sun had already been swallowed by a dense, suffocating wall of grey clouds. The wind did not just blow, it screamed. It tore through the thin fabric of her servant, dressed like 1,000 jagged blades, slicing across her exposed skin with merciless precision. Evelina forced one foot in front of the other, sinking up to her knees in the heavy, shifting snowdrifts. The temperature was dropping with terrifying speed. Within the first hour, she had lost all sensation in her toes, her boots feeling like blocks of solid lead. By the second hour, her fingers were locked into stiff, useless claws, completely unable to even pull her frayed wool cloak tighter around her violently shivering shoulders. The cold was no longer just an environmental factor, it was a physical entity. It was a rabid beast chewing on her bones, trying to dig its way into her marrow and stop her beating heart. She stumbled, her knee striking a jagged rock hidden beneath the deceptive powder. A sharp gasp tore from her throat, but the sound was instantly snatched away by the howling gale. She tried to push herself up to keep moving, but her muscles simply refused to obey. The physical deterioration was absolute. Her lungs burned with every shallow intake of freezing air, tasting of ice, pine, and copper. Beneath her dress, the lunar solis amulet pulsed with a faint, desperate warmth, trying to ignite the ancient sunborn magic dormant in her blood. But the sheer, overwhelming force of the blizzard was suffocating it. The amulet was designed to hide her power, not to heat her body, and now it was failing at both. Just a little further, she told herself, the thought sluggish and fragmented. Just to the tree line, but there was no tree line, only an endless, suffocating ocean of white. The mate bond, the invisible, golden thread that connected her soul to the newly awakened King Kenneth, throbbed in her chest with a dull, distant agony. It felt like a phantom limb bleeding out into the snow. The bond was stretching, pulling taut across the miles of frozen wasteland. She wondered in the hazy, freezing corners of her fading consciousness if he would feel it when her heart finally stopped beating. If he would reach out for her in his delirium, not knowing why his bedchamber suddenly felt so entirely, hopelessly empty. Her boots slipped on a hidden patch of black ice. She went down hard. She didn't try to get back up. The freezing snow felt strangely soft against her bruised cheek. Silence. Cold darkness. The snow rapidly began to cover her still form, a heavy, freezing blanket burying her quiet dignity beneath the unforgiving winter. The howling of the wind faded into a dull roar, and then into a peaceful, empty nothing. When consciousness finally returned, it did not come gently. It arrived as a sudden, excruciating barrage of pain. Evelina gasped, her eyes flying open as thousands of invisible needles pierced her skin. The agony of returning circulation made her cry out, her back arching off a firm, lumpy mattress. She was no longer buried in the snow. The air in her lungs was thick and suffocatingly hot, smelling of burning pine wood, drying sage, and bitter medicinal herbs. It was a sharp, overwhelming contrast to the void she had just escaped. "Hold still, you foolish girl. If you thrash about, you will shock your heart into stopping," a gruff, familiar voice commanded, cutting through the haze of pain. Evelina blinked rapidly through the stinging blur of her vision. The flickering, bright orange light of a massive stone hearth cast dancing shadows across the low, wooden ceiling of a small, unfamiliar cabin. Sitting beside the bed, holding a steaming wooden bowl that smelled strongly of bone broth, was Mistress Tabitha Geller. The stern head housekeeper of the royal palace looked entirely out of place in this rustic setting. Her usually immaculate grey hair was escaping its tight bun in wild, damp wisps, and her heavy apron was stained with soot and crushed healing herbs. "Tabitha," Evelina rasped, her throat feeling like cracked parchment, her voice barely a whisper. "How? I have my ways out of that cursed fortress, and I know every secret passage built into those black stones." Tabitha interrupted sharply, setting the heavy bowl down on a bedside stool with a loud clatter. She leaned over, her rough, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as she pressed a warm, damp cloth against Evelina's feverish forehead. "When that venomous snake, Cassandra, announced your exile in front of the guards, I knew you wouldn't survive the blizzard outside Waitress. I took the old servant tunnels. Found you half buried in a snowdrift near the weeping pines. Another 10 minutes out there, and you would have been a statue of ice." Evelina closed her eyes, the sheer relief of the ambient warmth causing a fresh wave of deep, bone-weary exhaustion to wash over her. She was safe. She had somehow survived the execution order. But, as she tried to sink back into the soft pillows and let the restorative sleep claim her, Tabitha's hand suddenly moved beneath the heavy wool blankets. The head housekeeper pressed her palm flat against Evelina's lower abdomen. The touch was not merely physical. A sudden, sharp pulse of raw energy travelled from Tabitha's palm, bypassing the lingering physical of Evelina's skin and sinking directly into her core. The older woman closed her eyes, her lips moving in a rapid, silent, ancient diagnostic chant. The air in the small cabin seemed to vibrate, humming with the deep resonance of old pack magic. Evelina felt a sudden, profound shift within her own body. It was as if a tiny glowing ember, buried deep in the freezing dark of her own womb, had suddenly flared to brilliant life. A rush of fierce, protective heat bloomed inside her, rushing outward to meet Tabitha's invasive magic in a sudden defensive surge. To Evelina's utter shock, the energy radiating from her own centre was not the golden warmth of her sun-born heritage. It was a piercing, brilliant, liquid silver. It was the exact, unmistakable magical signature of the ancient royal Lycan bloodline. The blood of the sovereign crown of Waitress, the blood of King Kenneth Sterling, forged from a single, forbidden night of fevered healing months ago that she had sworn to take to her grave. Tabitha's eyes snapped open. The stern, unflappable housekeeper actually recoiled a fraction of an inch, pulling her hand back as if burned. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared down at the quiet maid, her eyes wide with shock. The silence in the small cabin stretched, thick and vibrating with the immense weight of the impossible truth that had just been exposed. "You didn't know," Tabitha breathed, her voice dropping to a harsh, trembling, disbelieving whisper. It wasn't a question. Evelina stared, her hands trembling violently as they moved beneath the blankets to cover her own stomach. The crushing reality of the king's child growing within her, finally breaking through her silent armor. She did not cry. She did not break down into hysterical sobs or scream at the cruel twisting of fate that had cast her out into the ice. Instead, Evelina slowly pulled her knees up, curling her body into a protective crescent over her womb. The heavy wool blankets felt entirely inadequate against the bone-deep chill seeping through the floorboards. She closed her eyes, focusing entirely on the physical sensation of the ancient lichen magic. It was a piercing, brilliant liquid silver pulse beating in perfect, frantic time with her own racing heartbeat. It was a terrifying, undeniable warmth anchored deep in her core, heavy and possessive, completely distinct from her own suppressed power. I thought it was just the residual magic from the healing. Evelina rasped. Her throat was still raw and bloody from screaming against the icy gales outside the fortress. Her voice was flat, eerily devoid of the panic Mistress Tabitha Geller clearly expected. That night, when his fever spiked and Elder Julian Finch said his heart was failing, I bypassed the sentries. I used my own blood to stabilize his core. I knew the risks of getting too close to a feral alpha in the dark. Tabitha slowly sat back in her wooden chair. The heavy ceramic bowl of bone broth in her lap was entirely forgotten, the steam curling uselessly into the frigid air, dissipating into nothing. The stern housekeeper stared at the quiet maid, as if seeing her for the very first time. The puzzle pieces of the last 4 months were violently slamming into place. The reason the volatile, cursed Alpha King had never attacked Evelina during those terrifying, blood-soaked dawns. The reason the poisoned winter rose tea had miraculously stopped decaying his mind whenever Evelina was the one who served it. And now, the catastrophic reality that the true heir to the royal throne was lying in a hidden timber shack in the middle of a deadly winter storm, exiled by a traitorous noblewoman who had no idea what she had just thrown away. The royal bloodline is lethal to a mortal vessel, Tabitha breathed. Her voice was entirely stripped of its usual sharp, commanding authority. She leaned forward, her eyes wide as she stared at the faint, silver glow that seemed to radiate from beneath the thick furs covering Evelina's stomach. A lichen pup requires immense magical heat to survive the gestation. It will mercilessly drain your core temperature to fuel its own growth. Out here in the frozen wasteland, the cold will not just freeze your skin. It will freeze your blood from the inside out as the child takes whatever warmth you have left. You will turn to ice. Evelina kept her head bowed and her spine straight against the pillows. She felt the terrifying truth of Tabitha's words already manifesting in her marrow. Despite the roaring fire in the massive stone hearth and the heavy furs piled on top of her, a deep, unnatural chill was creeping through her veins. The liquid silver energy of the unborn pup was ravenous. It was instinctively pulling at her body's resources to shield itself from the hostile environment. It was a brutal survival instinct inherited directly from its father, the apex predator of the north. "Then I will give it what it needs," Evelina said quietly. She reached up with pale, stiff fingers and grasped the heavy silver chain resting against her collarbone. The ancient relic felt like a block of solid ice against her fragile skin. For years, the ancient relic had served as her invisible prison. It had bound her true nature, strictly suppressing the impossibly sweet, potent scent of her hidden sun-born bloodline so she could survive as a lowly servant in a world ruled by wolves. She had kept it clasped through the public humiliation, through the endless scrubbing of cold stone floors, and through the terrifying, silent mornings in the king's bedchamber. Because staying hidden was the only way to stay alive. But everything had changed now. Her thumb found the hidden clasp. She pressed down. The heavy silver chain snapped open with a sharp, metallic click. The physical release was explosive. The moment the enchanted metal left her skin, a shockwave of pure, unadulterated thermal energy erupted from Evelina's chest. The sudden, massive shift in atmospheric pressure caused the flames in the stone hearth to violently flare, shifting in an instant from a natural orange to a blinding, brilliant gold. The bitter, musty smell of drying sage and pine was instantly obliterated. In its place, the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of crushed, sun-warmed summer petals, wild honey, and heavy ozone flooded the small room. It was the scent of life itself, ancient and untamed. The cabin's timbers groaned as the sudden shift in temperature tested their frozen joints. Tabitha threw her arms up, shielding her eyes as the wave of heat hit her like a physical wall. The thick frost that had thickly coated the inside of the cabin's small window panes instantly flashed into steam, running down the glass in weeping rivulets. The heavy chill that had permeated the timber walls vanished, replaced by a deep, prickling warmth that sank straight into the bone. Evelina gasped, her back arching off the mattress as decades of suppressed magic flooded her very blood. Her skin literally glowed, emitting a soft, golden luminescence that drove back the dim corners of the room. But the most profound change was happening deep within her womb. The moment the golden sunborn magic flooded her veins, the liquid silver energy of the lichen pup reacted. It did not fight the heat, it reached out for it. The golden thread of her ancient magic wrapped around the silver pulse of the child, weaving together in a perfect symbiotic embrace. The violent shivering that had racked Evelina's body instantly ceased. The unnatural cold in her marrow was replaced by a steady, powerful, thrumming heat. Goddess above, Tabitha breathed, lowering her trembling arms slowly. The older woman stared at Evelina in absolute awe, the stern lines of her face completely slack. "You are Sunborn, the lost healers of the southern peaks. I thought your kind were wiped out in the Ash Wars centuries ago. We hid," Evelina corrected softly. Her breathing finally returned to a normal, steady rhythm as she dropped the heavy, useless amulet onto the wooden floorboards. It clattered loudly, nothing more than a dead piece of metal. We hid and we served and we survived. Over the next 3 weeks, the snow-covered pine forest proved exactly why they were considered a definitive execution sentence. The blizzards did not stop. The snow piled up endlessly against the small timber walls until the cabin was entirely buried, transforming it into a hidden, subterranean sanctuary beneath the frozen earth. The wind screamed day and night, a constant deafening roar that made the heavy roof beams groan and shudder. No ordinary human, and indeed very few fully shifted lichens, could have survived the sheer, brutal drop in temperature. But inside the buried cabin it was summer. Evelina adapted to the harsh lifestyle of the frozen exile with the quiet, unbroken dignity that defined her very existence. Without the amulet suppressing her true nature, she became the living, breathing hearth of their sanctuary. She learned to consciously manifest her sunborn magic, channeling the golden heat deeply into the floorboards and the stone walls. When Tabitha braved the freezing tunnels they had dug to retrieve frozen roots and buried caches of dried meat, Evelina would sit cross-legged on the rug, her hands pressed flat against the wood, projecting warmth to keep the ambient temperature high enough to sustain them both. She did not wait to be rescued. She did not sit by the window, staring out into the white abyss, crying for the mate who had allowed her to be cast out, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. Crying would not keep her child alive. The mate bond, that phantom thread of molten gold connecting her soul to the Alpha King, was still there, buried deep in the center of her chest, but it was agonizingly silent. It felt like a physical wound that had scabbed over, aching with a dull, throbbing pressure every time the wind howled outside. She ignored it, violently funneling every ounce of her energy, every drop of her golden magic, into the silver life growing inside her. She was a mother now, and a mother's protection was absolute. Miles away, beyond the frozen borders of the wintry woodlands, the fortress of Waitress was descending into absolute, irreversible madness. The royal bedchamber was a nightmare of suffocating, toxic heat. The air was so intensely thick with the scent of dark magic, decayed winter rose, and feral aggression that the sentries stationed outside the heavy oak doors wore thick leather masks just to filter their breathing. The temperature in the stone corridor was freezing, but inside the king's domain it was a sweltering, poisonous hell. King Kenneth Sterling was dying, and this time he was entirely awake to feel it happening. The residual poison of the winter rose tea, which Evelina had painstakingly purified every single morning for 4 months, was now running completely unchecked through his massive body. It felt like liquid lead sludge scraping through his veins, burning his nerve endings and slowly paralyzing his vast muscles. But the physical agony of the venom was absolutely nothing compared to the catastrophic psychological devastation of his waking wolf. His feral beast was tearing at the inside of his ribcage, driven completely insane by the sudden, violent severing of the calming presence that had anchored him. For nearly 4 months, his subconscious had relied on the quiet, soothing scent of ozone and sweet sun. He had desperately depended on the microscopic traces of golden magic that the unknown maid had bled into his tea to keep him tethered to his sanity. And then, on the dawn of his awakening, in the brief chaotic seconds before his muscles locked, and the venom dragged him to the floor, his wolf had recognized her. His mate, his true fated mate? A quiet girl in a frayed wool dress who had stared at his terrifying, scarred form without a single ounce of fear, and he had let Lady Cassandra Thorne drag her away. Kenneth lay sprawled across the massive dark velvet bed, his broad chest heaving with ragged, wet breaths. His skin was burning up, slick with toxic sweat, the ancient battle scars on his chest standing out stark white against the flushed, feverish muscle. His eyes fixed on the dark stone ceiling, where a swirling storm of molten gold and milky poison. He could not move his legs. He could barely lift his massive hands. The muscular paralysis of the tea was specifically designed to keep the Alpha King entirely compliant, a helpless prisoner in his own flesh. The heavy iron hinges of the bedroom door groaned, cutting sharply through the heavy silence. Kenneth's jaw clenched. The sound of high-heeled boots clicking against the stone floor echoed in the sweltering room. The scent hit his highly sensitive olfactory nerves a fraction of a second later. Expensive, cloying perfumes deliberately designed to mask the sharp, bitter stench of nightshade and dark magic. Lady Cassandra Thorne. She walked perfectly into his line of sight, her crimson silk skirts whispering against the floorboards. Trailing 2 steps behind her, looking deeply haggard and defeated, was Elder Julian Finch. The royal physician carried a heavy silver tray. Resting on the tray was a steaming porcelain cup of dark liquid. "My poor, suffering king," Cassandra crooned, her voice dripping with venomous, manufactured sympathy. She stepped up to the edge of the bed, reaching out a perfectly manicured hand to stroke the damp, dark hair away from Kenneth's forehead. Her touch was ice-cold, completely devoid of any true warmth or magic. It made his feral wolf violently recoil in pure, primal disgust. "The fever has taken you again. The curse is so stubborn, but do not worry. I have brought your medicine. The council is deeply concerned for your health, but I have assured them I will care for you until your inevitable rest." Kenneth did not speak. His throat was locked, paralyzed by the venom, but his golden eyes tracked her every movement with the lethal, calculating intensity of an apex predator watching a snake slither into its den. "Elder Finch," Cassandra ordered, not bothering to look back at the physician. "Prepare the tea. He must drink the entire cup today. We cannot have him suffering these violent waking spasms. It is bad for the morale of the pack." Julian Finch stepped forward, his aged hands trembling slightly as he lifted the porcelain cup. The old wolf kept his eyes averted, staring at the floorboards out of deep, insurmountable shame. He was bound by blood oaths to the royal council, forced to obey the acting regent while the king was incapacitated. He did not know the tea was poisoned. He only knew that nothing else kept the king's violent outbursts at bay. Cassandra took the cup from Julian's shaking hands. She leaned over Kenneth, her cruel smile widening as she pressed the rim of the porcelain against his cracked, feverish lips. "Drink, my king. Let the dark take you. It will all be over soon, and I will wear the sovereign crown of Valdris in your stead." The scent of the winter rose tea flooded Kenneth's highly attuned senses. The bitter, rotting smell of the nightshade. It was the exact smell that had trapped him in the nightmare for months. But beneath that smell, clinging desperately to the faint memory of the room, was the phantom scent of ozone and sweet sun, the scent of the quiet maid, the scent of his true mate, who had stood exactly where Cassandra was standing, pouring her own life force into this very cup to save him. The invisible mate bond in his chest, a heavy golden thread that stretched out into the freezing unknown, suddenly gave a violent, agonizing tug. It was a physical sensation of distance and loss so profound it felt like his heart was being brutally ripped out through his ribs. She was out there in the ice. The woman who had saved him in absolute silence was freezing to death because of the venomous parasite standing over his bed. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum. Mine. The hollow ache inside Kenneth's chest violently imploded. It was instantly replaced by an explosion of pure, unadulterated, world-ending rage. The feral wolf did not just push against the poison, it annihilated it. The sheer force of the Alpha King's primal fury generated a spike of internal adrenaline, so massive it physically burned the venom completely out of his bloodstream. The temperature in the room skyrocketed, the oppressive heat turning actively hostile, a physical manifestation of his murderous wrath. Before the first drop of poisoned tea could touch his lips, Kenneth's massive hand snapped up from the bedsheets. He moved before the air in the room could shift. His fingers, heavy and scarred, closed around Cassandra's delicate wrist like a steel vice. The bone beneath his unrelenting grip gave a sickening, echoing crack. Cassandra shrieked, a high-pitched sound of pure terror, completely dropping the porcelain cup. It hit the stone floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces, the dark, toxic tea splashing across the velvet rugs and instantly eating away at the rich fabric with a faint acidic hissing sound. "You," Kenneth rasped. His voice was a horrific, grating growl, sounding like two heavy boulders grinding together. He had not spoken in 4 long months. The sound vibrated through the thick stone walls, causing the heavy iron chandelier above them to tremble violently. Cassandra fell to her knees beside the bed, desperately trying to claw his hand away from her crushed wrist, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure agony and shock. "Sentries, men, help me!" she screamed, looking wildly toward the heavy oak doors. The heavily armed soldiers rushed into the room, their broadswords drawn, but they froze the very instant they crossed the threshold. King Kenneth Sterling was sitting up. The heavy, paralyzing chains of the poison had been completely shattered by pure, protective fury. He swung his massive legs over the edge of the bed, his bare feet hitting the floorboards with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the winter fortress of Waitress. He did not let go of Cassandra's wrist. He dragged her ruthlessly across the floor as he stood to his full, terrifying height, towering over everyone in the room like a god of war, awoken early from his slumber. His eyes were no longer clouded. They were a brilliant, burning, completely lucid molten gold. The aura of the Alpha King expanded, slamming into every wolf in the room like a physical shockwave. Elder Julian Finch instantly dropped to his knees, his chin hitting his chest in absolute, involuntary submission to his sovereign. The armed sentries at the door immediately threw their broadswords to the stone floor, the metal clattering loudly before they, too, dropped to their knees, baring their necks in terror. "Where is she?" Kenneth snarled, his voice dropping an octave, rattling the glass in the frosted windows. He yanked Cassandra upward by her broken wrist, ignoring her breathless, sobbing pleas, bringing her Tephrohydphus inches from his own. The heat radiating off his skin was lethal. "The maid you exiled, where is my mate?" Cassandra's eyes widened in sheer horror. She finally realized the full magnitude of her fatal miscalculation. She hadn't just exiled a servant. She had exiled the king's true fated mate. Cassandra stammered, tears ruining her perfect makeup, her aristocratic arrogance entirely broken by the primal terror of the beast holding her. "Into the snow. It has been 3 weeks. She is dead, my king. She is already dead." The words hit Kenneth like a physical blow to the center of his chest. 3 weeks. 3 weeks in the legendary blizzards of the frozen timberland. Kenneth violently threw Cassandra aside. She crashed into the heavy wooden vanity, collapsing into a sobbing, trembling heap on the floor. He did not spare her a single glance. His vengeance could wait. The poison still lingering in his veins could wait. The political collapse of his treacherous court could wait. The golden thread in his chest was weak, stretched to its absolute breaking point, but it had not snapped. She was alive, barely. He didn't know how she had survived the blizzards. He didn't know what ancient magic was keeping her heart beating in this ice, and he definitely didn't know that she was currently using that magic to protect the royal lichen heir growing in her womb. All he knew was the frantic, devastating need to find the woman who had walked away in silent dignity while he lay trapped in his own flesh. Kenneth did not grab a cloak. He did not issue orders to his cowering men. He simply turned and stalked out of the sweltering bedchamber. his massive, scarred form moving with a terrifying, predatory grace. He shattered the heavy oak doors off their iron hinges with a single swipe of his hand, ignoring the splinters that cut deeply into his skin. He broke into a dead sprint down the freezing stone corridors of Waitress. The cold air felt like absolutely nothing against the burning, raging inferno of his wolf. His claws lengthened with every stride, scoring deep grooves into the ancient stone floor. He reached the massive iron gates of the courtyard and did not wait for the sentries to open them. He vaulted over the heavy barricades, his bones cracking and shifting mid-air in a visceral explosion of power as he surrendered entirely to the beast. The transformation was instantaneous and brutal, fueled entirely by the primal need to protect what was his. A massive, pitch-black timber wolf, larger than a warhorse, landed heavily in the deep drifts, kicking up a cloud of silver frost as it bound into the storm. The snow-covered pine forests were not merely an environment. They were a living, actively hostile entity designed to crush the weak and bury the forgotten. For a massive, pitch-black timber wolf, tearing through the chest-high drifts, the blizzard was a physical wall of solid ice and screaming wind. The monarch pushed his feral form to the absolute breaking point. Every massive leap through the shifting powder sent agonizing spikes of pain through his joints. The venom of the winter rose tea had been violently burned out of his bloodstream by his sheer, world-ending rage, but the catastrophic physical damage it had left behind remained. His muscles tore with the brutal exertion, his lungs burned like dry parchment, inhaling sub-zero air that tasted of copper frostosta, yet the beast did not slow. It could not slow. The mate bond, the invisible, undeniable connection that tied his soul to the woman he had let slip through his fingers, was pulling him forward. It was a fragile, thrumming tether of molten gold in a world of absolute, unforgiving zero. Through the blinding whiteout, his enhanced olfactory senses frantically sifted through the overpowering scent of pine, dead earth, and ice, desperately searching for the singular, impossible fragrance of wild honey, crushed summer petals, and heavy ozone. It was terribly faint, buried under layers of frozen earth and howling gales, but to a starving predator who had spent months trapped in the dark, it was an undeniable beacon of salvation. He did not care about the political collapse occurring within the black stone walls of his fortress. He did not care about the treacherous counsel or the venomous lies as Lady Cassandra Thorne had spun to justify her execution order. His entire universe had violently narrowed down to a singular objective: reach the source of the golden heat before the ice extinguished it forever. The thought of her freezing, of that quiet dignity being buried beneath the snow, fueled a dark, obsessive terror in his chest that no physical pain could rival. Miles vanished beneath his bloodied paws. The storm raged with renewed fury, actively attempting to freeze the moisture in his eyes and the saliva in his jaws. The cold seeped past his thick dark fur, biting into his skin like 1,000 microscopic needles dipped in liquid nitrogen. Ice caked around his muzzle, and every exhalation produced a thick cloud of white steam that was instantly snatched away by the gale. As the hours bled into the deep, suffocating darkness of a winter night, his massive form began to falter. The residual paralysis from the poison clawed relentlessly at his hind legs, a terrifying ghost of the cage that had held his mind for so long. The muscles in his thighs spasmed, threatening to lock completely. He stumbled, his massive snout crashing into a solid drift of black ice hidden beneath the powder. The impact jarred his skull, sending a shockwave of dizzying, blinding pain down his spine. He let out a low, vibrating snarl, forcing his heavy shoulders upward. He refused to yield to the cold. He was the sovereign. He was the apex predator of the North. He would not die in the snow while she was out here suffering the consequences of his blindness. He dug his claws into the ice, hauling himself forward by sheer, monstrous willpower alone. Suddenly, the golden thread in the center of his chest pulsed with a violent magnetic snap. The scent of ozone and sweet sun flared, no longer a distant, ghostly whisper, but a heavy, physical presence radiating from beneath the ground just ahead. A buried timber structure, a hidden subterranean sanctuary nestled deep beneath the tangled roots of the ancient weeping pines. The wolf dragged itself the final few yards, its limbs moving entirely on instinct. The feral drive finally surrendered to the devastating, catastrophic exhaustion of the human soul. The shift back to his two-legged form was not the explosive, terrifying display of a warrior king, but the desperate, collapsing surrender of a dying man. King Kenneth Sterling hit the frozen earth hard, his bare, scarred skin instantly searing against the biting ice. He crawled toward the heavy wooden door embedded in the snowbank, his massive hands numb, clumsy, and entirely unresponsive. His vision faded into a dark, swirling tunnel, the edges bleeding into nothingness. With the last ounce of his rapidly fading strength, he raised a heavy fist and let it fall against the solid timber. A single dull thud echoed into the howling night. Then the darkness claimed him completely. Inside the buried cabin, the temperature was a sweltering, golden summer. Evelina Vance sat cross-legged on the thick woven rug near the massive stone hearth, her hands resting gently over her swollen stomach. The liquid silver pulse of the royal lichen air beat in perfect, frantic harmony with her own radiant, sunborn magic. Mistress Tabitha Geller had ventured out into the freezing tunnels hours ago to secure the perimeter and gather deep frost roots, leaving the quiet maid entirely alone in the suffocating heat of her own making. The sudden, heavy thud against the reinforced door made Evelina freeze instantly. It was not the erratic battering of the wind. It was a physical, deliberate impact. Her breath hitched sharply in her throat. The phantom mate bond in the center of her chest, which had been a dull, throbbing ache for 3 agonizing weeks, suddenly erupted into a blinding, searing inferno. The sheer heat of it was so intense it violently stole the air from her lungs. The golden thread snapped taut, vibrating with the devastating, undeniable presence of an apex predator right on her threshold. She scrambled to her feet, her coarse wool skirts swishing loudly against the wooden floorboards. She did not hesitate. She did not fear the absolute darkness waiting outside. She moved with purpose, unlatching the heavy iron bolt and yanking the thick timber door inward. A massive, unconscious body fell forward, accompanied by a brutal, shrieking rush of freezing wind that instantly bit into her exposed skin. Evelina gasped, falling hard to her knees as the towering form of the monarch collapsed onto the cabin floor. The sheer physical size of the man was overwhelming. He was completely bare, his skin pale and terrifyingly blue, tinged from the lethal cold. He was covered in fresh, bleeding scratches from the jagged ice, overlapping the ancient, raised battle scars of his violent past. The overwhelming scent of wild ozone, dark pine, and raw, freezing blood flooded the warm, sacred sanctuary of the cabin. He was here, the terrifying warlord who had let her be dragged away by the guards, the man whose powerful child was currently draining her magic to survive. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, refusing to let the shock paralyze her, her hands moving with frantic, desperate purpose. She grabbed his massive, freezing shoulders, her muscles straining agonizingly against his impossible weight. His boots caught on the heavy snowdrift, adding dead weight to his already colossal frame. With a sharp, guttural exertion that tore at the ligaments in her arms, she dragged his heavy torso fully into the cabin. Her bare feet slipped on the frost she had just let inside, but she locked her knees, hauling him centimeter by agonizing centimeter across the threshold. Finally clearing the frame, she kicked the thick door shut with her heel to permanently seal out the screaming blizzard, dropping the heavy iron bolt back into place. The contrast between the freezing Alpha King and the sweltering heat of the cabin was violent. His skin felt like solid blocks of ice against her warm palms. Without a second thought, Evelina threw herself over his broad, shivering chest. She pressed her bare hands flat against the frozen, scarred muscle directly over his failing heart. She didn't hold back. She didn't hide. She unleashed the full, unsuppressed torrent of her ancient sunborn bloodline. A blinding golden luminescence exploded from her palms, bathing the dim cabin in brilliant light. The magic sank into his frozen flesh like a hot blade through silk, aggressively forcing his stalling heart to pump, ruthlessly burning the unnatural cold out of his marrow. The ambient temperature in the room spiked exponentially, the frozen timbers groaning and popping under the intense thermal pressure. Deep within her womb, the silver lichen magic flared brightly, recognizing the absolute presence of its sire. She wove its own protective, fierce energy into the golden flood she was pouring into his veins, creating a perfect, symbiotic loop of healing fire. Kenneth's massive chest he heaved violently. A ragged, wet gasp tore from his blue lips, but his eyes remained tightly shut. His body instinctively leaned into her touch, his subconscious feral wolf instantly recognizing the absolute, profound safety of her presence. He was broken, utterly exhausted, and hovering dangerously on the edge of death, but he was finally home. Evelina did not sleep a single wink that night. She spent hours meticulously and silently tending to the fallen sovereign. She dragged him fully onto the thick pile of furs near the hearth, washing the frozen, crusted blood from his skin, with bowls of warm water and crushing potent healing herbs against his torn muscles. She mapped the devastation the poison and the ice had wrought upon his massive frame, tracing the raised, jagged scars with a slow, trembling reverence. He was a terrifying beast of war, a sovereign who held the absolute power of life and death over thousands. Yet here, laid bare in the flickering firelight, he was completely at her mercy. By the time the faint, dreary grey light of dawn began to filter through the thick frost coating the window panes, Evelina's physical exhaustion was profound. The heavy, relentless toll of sustaining both the unborn Lycan pup and the freezing Alpha King had completely drained her magical reserves. Her limbs felt heavy, her vision blurring at the edges. Yet, the deeply ingrained habits of all those weeks of servitude could not be easily broken by a single night of chaos. Dawn was approaching. It was time to perform her duty. She moved quietly to the small wooden counter, her bare feet making absolutely no sound against the worn floorboards. She did not reach for the bitter, toxic nightshade that had defined her mornings in the winter fortress. Instead, she retrieved a small, dried bundle of lunar mint, a rare, incredibly potent herb Tabitha had gathered from the deep frost. It was specifically known for its ability to soothe feral instincts and clear a clouded mind without violently suppressing the inner wolf. She methodically crushed silver-tigent leaves into a ceramic bowl, her movements precise and practiced, born from a lifetime of hiding in plain sight. The sharp, impossibly clean scent of frost and sweet mint immediately filled the small space, cutting through the heavy smell of blood, sweat, and ozone that clung to the king. She poured steaming water from the heavy iron kettle over the crushed herbs, watching in complete silence as the liquid slowly turned a pale luminescent green. The steam curled upward, carrying the medicinal properties into the air. She rested her slender fingers over the thick rim of the cup, closing her eyes as she let a final, gentle pulse of her remaining golden sunborn magic bleed directly into the brew. The liquid glowed faintly for a fraction of a second, ensuring its healing properties were absolute, pure, and uniquely tailored to his ravaged system. She placed the steaming ceramic cup onto a simple wooden tray. The familiar physical weight of it in her hands sent a strange, deeply poignant ache through the center of her chest. For 4 agonizing months, this exact routine had been a terrifying, high-stakes dance with death. She had walked into his oppressive, sweltering bedchamber every single morning, bracing her body for the unpredictable violence of his cursed slumber, secretly purifying his poison while hiding her true nature. Now, in the quiet safety of her hidden sanctuary, she turned slowly, carrying the tray toward the heavy pile of furs by the roaring hearth. She expected to find him still lost in the dark depths of exhaustion. She expected to kneel carefully beside him, to gently coax the healing liquid past his cracked lips while his feral beast fought the lingering shadows in his mind. Instead, the sovereign was already sitting up. Evelina froze mid-step, her breath vanishing completely. The wooden tray trembled violently in her grasp, the ceramic cup rattling sharply against the wood, a stark, ringing sound in the utter silence of the cabin. He was awake, but this was not the chaotic, physically devastating awakening of day 120. This was not the feral, poisoned beast, violently fighting the muscular paralysis of the dark magic, stumbling blindly while the venom ruthlessly tore his mind apart. The monarch sat perfectly still amidst the thick animal furs, his massive, scarred shoulders relaxed, but carrying a lethal coiled tension that spoke of absolute control. The devastating, heavy aura of his sovereign power filled the small room to the brim, pressing down on the air itself, making it taste sharply of ozone, pine, and pure, unquestionable authority. His eyes were fixed entirely on her. They were a brilliant, flawless, piercing molten gold, clear, lucid, entirely unclouded by the milky, toxic fog of the curse. He watched her with a heavy, unblinking intensity that made her heart slam violently against her ribs. The silence stretched between them, thick, oppressive, and vibrating with the profound weight of 100 unspoken words. It was the silence of two souls, recognizing the gravity of their shared survival. He tracked her every micro-movement, the slight tremor in her wrists, the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the exact angle of her bowed head, like a starving man watching water flow from a stone. The mate bond between them did not just hum, it roared in a deafening crescendo. It was a torrential river of liquid fire snapping violently into place, across the physical space, separating them, locking their souls together with an absolute, undeniable finality that defied the laws of the very world they lived in. The phantom thread was no longer stretched across miles of ice. It was a short, burning chain pulling them inexorably closer. "You," Kenneth rasped. His voice was a deep, gravelly vibration that resonated in the absolute center of her bones, far removed from the feral, animalistic growls he had emitted in his cursed sleep. It was the voice of a man who had finally, desperately found the missing piece of his own soul. It was always you. For 119 days, she had been a ghost in his chambers, a faceless servant tasked with managing a monster. She had poured her magic into a void, expecting nothing in return but the continued survival of a man who belonged to a world far above her own. But now, as she knelt before him, looking into those lucid, burning eyes, the hierarchy of Waitress dissolved into meaningless ash. They were no longer a king and a maid. They were two halves of a fractured whole, finally colliding in the aftermath of a storm that was supposed to destroy them both. Evelina forced her shaking legs to close the remaining distance, kneeling carefully beside the furs with flawless, practiced grace. She offered the wooden tray forward, her voice perfectly even, betraying absolutely none of the chaotic storm raging in her chest. "Your tea, my king?" she whispered softly. Kenneth did not look at the steaming cup of lunar mint. He did not reach out to take the tray from her trembling hands. Instead, his massive, heavily scarred hand moved with terrifying, predatory swiftness, bypassing the wood entirely to gently, almost reverently, wrap around her delicate wrist. The heat of his skin was overwhelming, a stark burning contrast to the freezing ice she had pulled him from just hours ago. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum, unspoken but absolute, "Mine." "I do not need to sleep anymore," the monarch murmured, his golden eyes burning into hers with a ferocious intensity. "And you do not need to serve." His gaze slowly dropped from her face, deliberately tracing the frayed, worn lines of her coarse wool dress. Then his eyes stopped entirely. They settled firmly on the distinct, undeniable swizzle of her stomach, a physical truth she had expertly hidden during her days of servitude. The silence in the cabin became deafening, thick enough to cut with a heavy broadsword. The Alpha King's pupils dilated rapidly, completely swallowing the molten gold until his eyes were entirely, endlessly black. His newly awakened, enhanced lichen senses easily picked up the complex biological reality. She could no longer hide behind the discarded amulet. He could smell the wild honey and summer petals of her sunborn blood, a scent that meant safety, home, and absolute devotion. But beneath that unmistakable absolute, and impossibly strong, he sensed the brilliant, liquid silver pulse of his own sovereign bloodline. He could hear the rapid, tiny fluttering of a second heart, the heartbeat of a royal lichen pup, thrumming in perfect synchronized time with her own. His massive frame began to tremble. The realization hit the terrifying warlord with the physical force of a falling mountain, completely shattering his arrogant composure. She had not only saved his life every single morning in absolute thankless silence, she had carried his only heir into the freezing wastes, enduring the ultimate public humiliation and a guaranteed death sentence solely to protect the child he didn't even know existed. Kenneth slowly, deliberately slid off the furs. He lowered his massive body until his bare knees hit the wooden floorboards directly in front of her. The Alpha King of Waitress, the apex predator of the North, bowed his head. The terrifying warlord was kneeling. The image was so profoundly incongruous with the imposing, battle-hardened warlord she had served for 4 months that Evelina Vance's mind struggled to fully process it. This was the undisputed sovereign who commanded entire armies, the apex predator whose very presence caused elite, heavily armed warriors to drop to the stone floors of the great hall in sheer, trembling terror. Yet here he was, entirely stripped of his royal armor, bearing the jagged, raw, purple-bruised scars of a desperate, grueling journey through the ice, with his dark head bowed perfectly level with her womb. The silence in the sweltering timber cabin stretched thick and vibrating with a tension so heavy it felt almost suffocating. The only sounds were the crackling of the massive stone hearth and the deep, uneven rasp of his breathing. Slowly, with a hesitation she had never seen in him before, Kenneth raised his broad, calloused hands. He did not touch her immediately. His fingers, bruised and still stained with the faint, metallic scent of frozen blood, hovered just a fraction of an inch above the coarse, frayed wool of her dress. The blistering heat radiating from his skin waged a silent war against the lingering chill of the blizzard outside. He was asking for permission. The unyielding sovereign of the North, a man who took whatever he desired by divine right, was physically waiting for the quiet maid's consent. Every ounce of his lethal strength was meticulously restrained. Evelina's breath hitched. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, but her hands, which had been gripping the edges of the wooden serving tray, slowly uncurled. She set the ceramic cup of steaming lunar mint aside on the floorboards. The soft clatter of the porcelain seemed to break a heavy, ancient spell. Trembling slightly, she reached out and placed her pale, slender fingers gently over his scarred ones, pressing them down against the undeniable swells of her stomach. The physical contact was explosive. The absolute moment his blistering skin met hers through the thin, worn fabric, a shockwave of pure, unadulterated sensory overload ripped through the small, sweltering room. The golden thread of their mate bond, which had been a desperate, painfully pulling tether, stretched to its breaking point across miles of frozen snow, suddenly and violently solidified. It became a rushing, roaring river of liquid fire, surging back and forth between their chests with the devastating force of a breaking dam. The heat seared away the remnants of the cold, rewriting the very air in the cabin into something thick, sacred, and infinitely heavy. Kenneth let out a low, shuddering breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. Beneath his palms, he could feel the frantic, rapid fluttering of the second heart. The brilliant, liquid silver pulse of his own royal lichen bloodline surged upward, eagerly greeting the immense, overwhelming presence of its sire. It wove flawlessly with the radiant golden warmth of Evelina's sunborn magic, creating a perfectly synchronized biological rhythm that resonated directly into the monarch's marrow. It was not merely a magical connection. It was a physical tether anchoring him to the very earth. "You took my child into the freezing blizzard," the warlord rasped, his deep voice breaking over the harsh syllables. He did not lift his head. His broad, heavily scarred shoulders shook, the heavy muscles corded with a devastating, paralyzing mixture of profound reverence and absolute, world-ending guilt. "Cassandra ordered you out into the freezing wilderness to die, and you did not say a single word. You did not scream the truth to the guards. You did not beg for mercy. You just walked away into the freezing gale, carrying my heir. If I had spoken the truth, they would not have let me leave," Evelina replied softly. Her voice was remarkably steady, anchored by the ancient, quiet resilience of her hidden sunborn lineage. She looked down at the dark, damp, wildly unkempt hair of the kneeling man, fighting the desperate, overwhelming physical urge to run her pale fingers through the thick strands. "She knew I was the only thing keeping the spiked winter rose tea from completely destroying your mind. If I had revealed that I was carrying the royal lichen heir, the noblewoman would have slaughtered me right there on the cold stone floor of your bedchamber. The guards in the room were loyal to her coin, not your crown. I had to choose. I chose to save him." Kenneth's head snapped up. His molten gold eyes were entirely blown out, the pupils swallowing the irises in a display of raw, unrestrained feral emotion. The sheer intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, pressing against her skin, demanding absolute truth. "I was trapped. the king breathed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly rasp that vibrated through the wooden floorboards. He shifted his weight, moving closer until his bare knees brushed against the hem of her skirts, refusing to let any physical distance remain between them. On that morning, day 120, when the doors burst open and she declared your exile, my wolf was awake, Evelina. I recognized you. I felt the bond snap into place, a sudden, searing brand of gold and fire binding our ribs. He lifted one hand from her stomach, gently reaching up to cup her jaw. His thumb, rough and calloused from years of wielding a broadsword, traced the delicate line of her cheekbone with a dangerously fragile gentleness. The blistering heat radiating from his palm was a stark, agonizing contrast to the memory of the freezing blizzard she had barely survived. I wanted to tear her throat out, Kenneth continued, his words spilling out in a desperate, ragged, breathless confession. The absolute vulnerability of the sovereign was completely laid bare in the flickering, golden firelight, permanently stripping away the untouchable myth of the unfeeling monster. But the venom. The heavy nightshade paralysis was still burning deep in my veins. My muscles were entirely locked. The cursed draft turned my own bones into iron cages. My throat was paralyzed by the poison. I watched them drag you away, and I could not move a single muscle to stop them. I watched my own heart walk out of my chest into a frozen hell, and I was entirely, helplessly paralyzed. I screamed your name in my mind until my soul bled, but my body remained a tomb. The revelation hit Evelina with the concussive force of a physical blow to the sternum. For 3 agonizing, terrifying weeks, as she huddled in the buried, snow-crushed cabin, channeling every single ounce of her golden sunborn magic to keep their unborn child alive against the biting frost, she had carried the silent, unbearably heavy belief that he had simply let her go. She had forced herself to accept the brutal reality that a ruling monarch could not be expected to protect a lowly, wolfless servant, but he hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't turned away. He had been a prisoner locked inside his own poisoned flesh, suffering a psychological torture far worse than the freezing gales of the icy domain. He had bled internally for his absolute inability to save her. "I know," she murmured, her voice cracking as she finally leaned her cheek deeply into the blistering, calloused warmth of his palm. The last, lingering, deeply embedded shards of the bitter ice around her heart finally, irreversibly melted away into nothingness. "I know, Kenneth, you are here now." Hearing his given name fall so tenderly from her lips completely and utterly broke the remaining control of the Alpha King. He surged upward, pulling her entirely off the wooden floorboards and crashing her into his broad, heat-radiating chest. The embrace was desperate, all-consuming, and fiercely, fiercely protective. He buried his face deep in the crook of her neck, inhaling the rich, intoxicating scent of wild honey, crushed summer petals, and the unique sweet ozone of their unborn lichen pup. His powerful arms wrapped around her slender, fragile frame like unbreakable steel bands, shielding her from a world that had so viciously tried to destroy them both. Evelina wrapped her arms tightly around his broad, heavily scarred shoulders, burying her fingers into his dark hair. The physical sensation of the fated mate bond fully activating was a visceral, biological event. It was not merely an emotional realization, it was a fundamental rewriting of her very cells. The air in the cabin grew suffocatingly dense with ambient magic. The temperature spiked once more, not from her sunborn aura, but from the raw, ancient lichen life force Kenneth was deliberately, permanently binding to hers. He was actively funneling his own vitality, his own sovereign, apex strength, directly into her veins, ensuring that as long as his formidable heart beat in his chest, hers would never, ever stop. "I bind my soul to yours," the monarch murmured fiercely against her skin, the heavy words vibrating with the weight of ancient primal pack magic. It was the sacred, unbreakable vow of the royal claiming, spoken not in a grand vaulted cathedral surrounded by cheering, hypocritical nobles, but in a buried, frozen timber shack in the middle of a deadly blizzard. "My strength is your strength, my blood is your blood, not used, not owned, chosen. Forever, Evelina, you are my true Luna." Evelina's breath hitched, hot tears finally pricking the corners of her eyes. The sheer, overwhelming warmth of his absolute devotion washed away the trauma of the last 4 months. She was no longer the invisible, wolfless maid scrubbing the cold stone floors of Valdris. She was the true, undisputed Luna, anchored to a beast who would tear the world apart for her. "I choose you," she breathed back, her golden magic flaring in a brilliant, blinding pulse that completely illuminated the small cabin, sealing the ancient vow. The light washed over the rough timber walls, a beacon of defiance against the endless winter night. For a long, unbroken hour, they remained tangled together on the thick, heavily piled animal furs by the roaring, crackling hearth. Kenneth meticulously mapped the contours of her face, reverently tracing the lingering, purplish shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, his large hands constantly, obsessively returning to the swell of her stomach to feel the frantic, reassuring kicks of the royal air. They spoke in hushed, intimate confessions, weaving their fractured, agonizing pasts back together. Evelina quietly recounted the terrifying, blinding journey into the snow, the desperate, horrifying failure of the lunar solace amulet to hide her scent from the frost beasts, and Mistress Tabitha Geller's miraculous, life-saving intervention. The king listened with a dark, boiling, simmering fury steadily building in his golden eyes, his feral wolf violently, methodically cataloguing every single moment of suffering she had endured, silently adding it to the massive, incredibly bloody toll Cassandra Thorne was about to pay. But the quiet sanctuary of the buried cabin was not meant to last forever. The first sign of the impending catastrophe was not a sound, but a sudden, violent drop in the ambient temperature. Kenneth froze. His broad palm, which had been gently stroking Evelina's hair, instantly went rigid. The relaxed, intimate warmth radiating from his skin vanished in a microsecond, replaced by the lethal, freezing aura of the apex predator preparing for slaughter. His golden eyes snapped toward the heavy, reinforced timber door, the pupils rapidly dilating as his enhanced lichen senses pierced the physical barrier of the wood and the packed snow beyond. Evelina felt it a heartbeat later, the faint, metallic tang of unwashed armor, wet dog, and dark, aggressive intent bleeding through the howling wind outside. "They found us!" the warlord growled, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating frequency that made the ceramic cup on the floorboards rattle against the wood. "Cassandra's scouts," she breathed, her heart slamming violently against her ribs. She instinctively curled her hands over her stomach. The sudden spike in adrenaline caused the unborn pup's silver magic to flare defensively, demanding absolute protection from the encroaching threat. "Stay behind the hearth," the king commanded, his tone completely devoid of the gentle reverence he had shown moments ago. He was the sovereign now. He rolled off the furs in a single fluid motion, his heavily scarred body moving with a deadly lack of sound. He did not bother searching for a weapon. He was the weapon. Before Evelina could fully process the shift, the heavy timber door of the cabin exploded inward. The physical force of the breach was catastrophic. The thick wooden planks shattered into 1,000 deadly splinters, blown apart by a concentrated blast of dark pack magic. The shrieking, sub-zero gale of the blizzard violently flooded the sweltering room, instantly extinguishing the roaring fire in the hearth. The sudden plunge into freezing darkness was accompanied by the heavy, thudding sounds of combat boots hitting the floorboards as 6 heavily armed lichen assassins surged through the broken frame. They were massive, brutal men, clad in the thick, dark leather armor of the traitorous noblewoman's personal guard, wielding heavy silver broadswords designed to inflict maximum agony on shifted wolves. They had tracked the melted snow, the unnatural ambient heat radiating from the buried cabin, and the faint, lingering scent of the exiled maid. They had come to finish the execution. They did not expect to find the fully awakened, completely unhinged ruler of the North waiting for them in the dark. The lead assassin barely had time to register the towering silhouette in the center of the room before Kenneth moved. It was a smash cut of pure, unadulterated violence. The king did not shift fully into his wolf form. The enclosed space was too tight, and the risk of collateral damage to his mate was too high. Instead, he allowed the feral beast to partially surface, his muscles bulging obscenely as his fingers elongated into heavy, razor-sharp black claws. Kenneth launched himself forward like a released siege engine. He bypassed the swing of the first broadsword entirely, ducking under the silver blade with impossible speed. His unyielding grip closed around the attacker's throat. With a single, sickening twist of his wrist, the monarch crushed the man's windpipe, using the dying body as a physical shield against the second blade swinging through the dark. The sound of snapping bone echoed sharply over the howling wind. "The king!" one of the scouts screamed, his voice pitching up in absolute, unfiltered terror as the dim light caught the glowing, molten gold eyes of the sovereign. "It's the king! Fall back!" "Too late," Kenneth snarled. He threw the lifeless body of the first assassin into the advancing line, shattering the wooden table and sending 2 more men crashing into the stone wall, the small cabin devolving into a chaotic, blood-soaked nightmare of close-quarters slaughter. Evelina pressed herself tightly into the alcove behind the stone hearth, her hands glowing with a desperate defensive sphere of golden sunborn magic, shielding her womb from the flying debris. She watched the awe-inspiring display of supreme power with breathless reverence. The warlord fought with a heavy, lethal momentum, each strike deliberate and crushing. He moved with a brutal, predatory efficiency, his burning golden eyes leaving glowing trails in the freezing, absolute gloom. An assassin desperately lunged at his exposed flank, the silver blade grazing the king's ribs and drawing a line of his blood. Kenneth didn't even flinch. The physical pain simply fueled his world-ending, unhinged rage. He spun violently on his heel, his elongated black claws ripping through the attacker's reinforced leather armor like it was wet tissue paper, completely gutting the man before he could even draw a second, frantic breath. The remaining 3 men, suddenly realizing with horrific clarity that they were trapped in a confined, pitch-black space with a literal, enraged god of war defending his heavily pregnant fated mate, broke completely. The primal, overwhelming instinct to simply survive entirely overrode their purchased loyalty to the treacherous court. They dropped their silver broadswords and scrambled toward the shattered doorway, desperately trying to crawl back out into the freezing, blinding blizzard. Kenneth did not let a single one escape. He crossed the ruined room in 2 imposing strides, grabbing the last panicked man by the back of his armored collar and brutally, unforgivingly slamming him face first into the thick reinforced timber doorframe. The sickening loud crunch of bone signaled the absolute bloody end of the ambush. Silence violently descended upon the ruined, blood-soaked cabin once again, broken only by the howling, shrieking wind of the blizzard roaring through the shattered doorway and the heavy, ragged, adrenaline-fueled breathing of the Alpha King. Kenneth stood amidst the horrific carnage, his broad chest heaving, his bare, heavily muscled skin painted in the dark blood of the traitors. The oppressive aura of the apex predator was fully, unapologetically unleashed, filling the small space with a suffocating gravity that made the very air taste deeply of copper and imminent doom. He slowly turned his head, his burning golden eyes piercing the gloom to find Evelina hiding safely behind the stone hearth. Instantly, the murderous feral tension completely bled out of his powerful frame. He dropped heavily to one knee, completely ignoring the broken bodies scattered across his floorboards, his gaze entirely, obsessively focused on her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice thick with a raw, desperate, choking panic that completely contradicted the brutal, effortless violence he had just committed. "I am unharmed," she breathed, slowly stepping out from the protective alcove. The golden sphere of her defensive magic faded, leaving only the soft, ambient, ethereal glow of her skin to light the dark, ruined room. She did not look at the blood. She did not look at the dead, broken men. She looked only at the towering, fiercely protective mate who had just slaughtered an entire squad of elite assassins with his bare hands solely to keep her safe. Before Kenneth could respond, a sudden commotion echoed from the tunnel outside the broken door. A figure wrapped heavily in thick, snow-covered furs pushed their way through the wreckage, holding a glowing lantern and a bloodied iron hunting spear. Mistress Tabitha Geller stepped into the cabin, her breath frosting in the freezing air. She took one look at the shattered door, the dead assassins wearing the royal crest, and the towering, blood-soaked sovereign kneeling before the pregnant, glowing maid. The stern housekeeper didn't blink. She merely slammed the butt of her spear against the wooden floorboards. "I found their tracks 3 miles east," Tabitha announced grimly, violently kicking one of the dead scouts out of her way as she moved to quickly secure the compromised perimeter. "Cassandra is mobilizing the rest of the royal guard. She has officially declared the king dead from the poison and crowned herself Queen Regent. By nightfall, she will send an entire battalion into the snow-covered pine forests to burn this sanctuary to the ground, just to ensure there are absolutely no witnesses." Kenneth slowly rose to his feet. The unyielding, scarred ruler looked out through the violently shattered doorway, staring dead into the blinding, freezing whiteout of the raging blizzard. The hot blood dripping from his elongated black claws hissed faintly as it hit the encroaching, freezing snow. The profound, desperate, beautiful vulnerability he had shown Evelina just moments ago was entirely, lethally gone. In its place stood the cold, calculating, absolutely ruthless monarch of Valdris, fully awakened and ready to drench his empire in vengeance. He turned back to Evelina, his molten golden eyes locking fiercely onto hers. The fated mate bond thrummed violently between them, a solid, blinding chain of unbreakable fire that no army, no poison, and no traitorous noblewoman could ever sever. "She thought she could poison my mind," the king spoke, his voice carrying the heavy, chilling weight of absolute retribution. "She thought she could cast my mate and my heir into the ice to die in silence. She believes the sovereign crown belongs to her." He stepped over the wreckage, reaching out to gently, reverently wipe a stray speck of soot from Evelina's pale cheek. His touch was incredibly soft, a staggering contrast to the raw, unbridled fury that had just painted the walls of the cabin in crimson. The king was ready to take back his throne, and no one would stand in his way. The journey from the buried cabin back to the winter fortress of Valdris was not a desperate flight through the ice. It was a devastating march of conquest. The howling blizzard of the sub-zero timberlands, which had nearly claimed Evelina Vance's life just weeks prior, seemed to physically part before the terrifying, unhinged wrath of the Alpha King. King Kenneth Sterling did not shift back into his massive timber wolf form. He walked on 2 feet, a towering, heavily scarred god of war, wrapped in the thick animal furs Mistress Tabitha Geller had salvaged from the ruined sanctuary. He kept one heavy, blistering arm wrapped securely around Evelina's waist, actively funneling a constant, roaring stream of his apex lichen vitality into her veins to completely shield her and their unborn child from the sub-zero gales. The heavy, black stone gates of Valdris loomed on the horizon like the jagged teeth of a sleeping beast. Inside those ancient frost-covered walls, a treacherous court believed their sovereign was dead. They believed the quiet, wolfless maid who had served him was rotting beneath the snow. They were about to learn that the ice did not kill the king. It merely woke him up. Inside the cavernous throne room of the fortress, the atmosphere was a suffocating, putrid mixture of manufactured grief and toxic, unchecked ambition. Hundreds of elite nobles, pack alphas, and heavily armored council members were gathered beneath the massive iron chandeliers. The sprawling chamber, traditionally a place of sacred pack law and sovereign judgment, had been transformed into a theatre for high treason. At the far end of the room, standing confidently before the empty, obsidian throne, was Lady Cassandra Thorne. Cassandra didn't know the Alpha King's wolf had awakened. She didn't know the poison in his veins had been completely burned away by ancient sunborn magic. And she definitely didn't know that the quiet maid she had cast into the blizzard was returning to take her throne. All she knew was the intoxicating thrill of absolute power. The cruel noblewoman had entirely discarded the pretense of mourning. She was draped in layers of opulent, heavy black velvet and shimmering silver silk, her beautiful face twisted into an expression of arrogant, untouchable triumph. Resting on a velvet cushion beside her was the kingdom's highest artifact. She had not yet placed the heavy, glowing golden artifact upon her own head, but the intent was painfully obvious to every wolf in the room. She was currently delivering a dramatic, tear-filled eulogy for the fallen monarch, expertly spinning a web of venomous lies. The king's mind was completely shattered by the curse, Cassandra projected, her voice echoing off the high stone arches, dripping with false poisoned honey. She raised a perfectly manicured hand to wipe a non-existent tear from her eye. We all witnessed his violent, unpredictable descents into feral madness. He was a danger to himself and to this great empire, and when that wretched, treasonous servant girl poisoned his tea and fled into the blizzard, the final blow was struck. I tried to save him. I ordered the best healers to his bedside, but the venom was too strong. In the front row of the gathered assembly, Elder Julian Finch stood with his shoulders slumped in absolute, insurmountable defeat. The royal physician looked like a man who had aged a decade in a single week. His hands trembled as he gripped his wooden cane. He knew the absolute truth. He knew the exact chemical composition of the dark sludge he had been forced to prepare, and he knew the silent maid had been the only one purifying it. But he was bound by ancient blood oaths to the council, and with the king presumed dead, speaking out against the new queen regent was a guaranteed execution. But Valdris will not fall into chaos, the traitorous noblewoman continued, her voice rising in a flawless theatrical crescendo. She took a step toward the velvet cushion, her crimson-painted lips curving into a predatory smile. As the highest-ranking noble of the royal court, I will shoulder this heavy, tragic burden. I will wear the sovereign crown of Valdris to ensure our borders remain strong and our pack remains pure. She reached out, her delicate fingers brushing against the ancient, moon-magic-infused gold. Before she could lift the crown, the massive 20-foot-tall iron-wrought doors at the entrance of the royal chamber exploded inward. The sound was catastrophic, resembling the deafening crack of a lightning strike hitting solid rock. The heavy iron hinges completely sheared off, the massive doors slamming violently into the stone walls, with a force that shook the dust from the vaulted ceiling. The blinding, howling wind of the blizzard outside violently rushed into the cavernous room, instantly extinguishing half the candles in the iron chandeliers. The entire assembly of elite warriors and arrogant nobles whipped around, drawing their silver broadswords in a chaotic chorus of ringing metal. But the moment their enhanced olfactory senses caught the scent riding on the freezing wind, every single blade froze mid-air. It was the smell of wild ozone, dark pine and raw, absolute world-ending authority. The heavy, paralyzing aura of the apex predator slammed into the assembly room like a physical tidal wave. It did not merely demand respect, it violently forced submission. Within seconds, the collective feral instinct of hundreds of fully grown wolves screamed in pure, unadulterated terror. Broadswords clattered loudly against the stone floor as heavily armored warriors involuntarily dropped to their knees, baring their necks in absolute surrender to the crushing, suffocating pressure of their true ruler. The Alpha King stalked through the shattered doorway. The shadows of the storm clung to his massive, heavily scarred frame like a dark cloak. His eyes were not the milky, poisoned fog the court had seen for 4 months. They were a brilliant, burning, completely lucid molten gold. He radiated a lethal, blistering heat that instantly evaporated the snow from his boots, his elongated black claws flexing at his sides. But he did not walk alone. At his side, completely unbothered by the terrifying aura that was currently forcing elite generals to the floor, walked Evelina. She was no longer wearing the coarse, frayed servant dress of a lowly maid. She was wrapped in thick, luxurious white furs, her pale skin glowing with the soft ethereal, radiant warmth of her fully awakened, sun-born bloodline. For the first time since she had arrived at the Winter Fortress, she did not keep her head bowed. Her spine was perfectly straight, her chin held high with the quiet, unbroken dignity of a true sovereign. The intoxicating, overwhelmingly sweet scent of crushed summer petals and wild honey completely neutralized the bitter, toxic smell of Cassandra's expensive perfumes. The contrast between the towering, blood-soaked warlord and the radiant, golden woman beside him was a masterpiece of impossible power. They walked slowly down the long center aisle of the throne room, the heavy silence broken only by the deliberate, echoing thud of the king's boots. The crowd parted violently, scrambling over each other to clear a path, their eyes wide with sheer disbelieving horror and awe. At the far end of the hall, the cruel noblewoman had gone entirely, deathly pale. Her hand hovered uselessly over the golden crown, the arrogant, untouchable triumph on her beautiful face shattered into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. She stumbled backward, her high heels catching on her heavy velvet skirts, her breath coming in short, hyperventilating gasps.
Kenneth,
she stammered, her voice cracking, completely devoid of its poisoned honey.
My king, you...
The scouts said you were dead. The poison. A name unspoken for months grows teeth, Cassandra, the monarch growled. His voice dropped to a lethal, vibrating frequency that shook the stone floorboards beneath their feet. He stopped 10 paces from the dais, his massive frame shielding Evelina from the desperate, cornered glares of the traitor's personal guard. And I have returned to bite. He did not immediately attack. He was not a feral beast lashing out blindly in the dark anymore. He was a calculating, ruthless ruler, conducting a public execution of character. Kenneth slowly turned his burning golden gaze toward the front row of the kneeling assembly, locking eyes with the trembling royal physician. Elder Julian Finch, the warlord commanded, the absolute authority in his tone, slicing through the tension like a hot blade through silk. You are released from your blood oaths to the council. Stand and speak the truth to your king, or die on your knees holding her lies. The old doctor violently flinched. For a terrifying second, the massive court held its collective breath. Then, driven by the sheer, undeniable reality of his sovereign's resurrection and the radiant, ancient magic glowing from the pregnant maid beside him, the physician slowly pushed himself up with his wooden cane. Julian's hands were no longer shaking. A profound, desperate relief washed over his aged features. I will speak the truth, my king, the elder rasped, his voice echoing loudly in the silent hall. He turned to face the hundreds of stunned nobles, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at the pale, shrinking noblewoman on the dais. Over the past season, I was forced by Lady Cassandra to prepare the winter rose tea, but it was not a cure. It was heavily spiked with a slow-acting dark nightshade paralysis intended to permanently trap the king's wolf and rot his mind. She held my family hostage to ensure my silence. She intended to slowly murder our sovereign and frame his ultimate death on the curse. Gasps of genuine horror rippled through the gathered assembly. The political foundation of the treacherous court was instantly, violently crumbling. Lies! Cassandra shrieked, her composure entirely snapping. She pointed a manicured finger at Evelina, her eyes wide with desperate, unhinged madness. He is protecting the real assassin. The wolfless maid poisoned him. She manipulated his mind with dark magic. Look at her. She is a witch. She is my fated mate. The monarch roared. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum. Mine. The sheer volume of his voice was a physical concussive blast. The iron chandeliers rattled violently. The declaration hit the crowd like a meteor strike. The Alpha King did not just claim her. He projected the undeniable biological reality of their bond across the room. The golden thread connecting their souls flared visibly for a fraction of a second, an ancient, unquestionable display of true mate recognition. And beneath that golden light, the elite lichen alphas in the room suddenly caught the distinct, impossible scent they had missed in the chaos, the brilliant, liquid silver pulse of the royal lichen air, beating steadily, strongly, and fiercely protected within the womb of the glowing woman. She is a sun-born healer, the last of an ancient bloodline, the physician continued, his voice gaining strength, entirely destroying the last remnants of the traitor's defense. Julian looked at Evelina with profound, tear-filled reverence. She did not poison the king. She saved him. Every single morning, while we stood by in ignorance, this quiet woman secretly poured her own life force into the toxic cup, neutralizing the nightshade and keeping his heart beating. And for her absolute loyalty, Cassandra framed her for treason and cast her into a deadly blizzard to freeze to death, knowingly attempting to murder the true Luna of Valdris and the unborn royal heir. The silence that followed was absolute. The horrifying gravity of the crimes committed by the ambitious noblewoman sank into the marrow of every wolf in the room. Attempted regicide, the attempted murder of a fated mate, the attempted slaughter of the royal bloodline. In the strict, primal hierarchy of the pack, these were sins that demanded absolute, unmerciful annihilation. Cassandra looked wildly around the room, realizing with crushing, suffocating certainty that not a single warrior was going to step forward to defend her. The men she had bribed were pressing their faces into the stone floor, desperate to distance themselves from her impending doom. She had lost. I only wanted what was best for Valdris. She sobbed, dropping to her knees, finally displaying the pathetic begging weakness she had expected from Evelina all those weeks ago. But begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. She is a peasant, a servant. She is unworthy of the sovereign crown. I would have brought you armies, Kenneth. I would have secured you absolute power. The king did not flinch. His expression was a mask of cold, unyielding stone. I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that to happen, he stated softly. The quiet promise carrying more lethal weight than a scream. You tried to bury my light in the ice. Now you will learn what lives in the dark. He raised a single, scarred hand. He did not need to perform the execution himself. A sovereign's judgment was enough. 2 elite guards, desperate to prove their reclaimed loyalty, instantly surged up from the floor. They grabbed the screaming, thrashing noblewoman by her arms, violently stripping the heavy silk and velvet from her shoulders, officially tearing away her rank, her titles, and her protection. The pack magic actively rejected her, severing her connection to Valdris with a sharp, agonizing tear that made her shriek in genuine pain. Throw her into the Whispering Wastes, the warlord commanded coldly, echoing the exact sentence she had passed upon his mate. Leave her no cloak. Allow her no provisions. Let her see if her ambition can keep her warm when the blizzards come. As the guards dragged the weeping, broken traitor out of the throne room, her hysterical cries echoing down the black stone corridors until they faded into nothingness, the heavy, oppressive tension in the room finally began to crack. Justice had been ruthlessly, publicly served. The rot had been excised from the heart of the Empire, but the Alpha King was not finished. He turned slowly, fully facing Evelina. The terrifying, murderous aura of the apex predator instantly dissolved, replaced by a profound, breathtaking vulnerability that shocked the remaining nobles to their core. In front of hundreds of elite warriors, pack alphas, and political rivals, the unyielding sovereign of the North did the unthinkable. Kenneth Sterling dropped to his knees. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous hall, but the monarch ignored them entirely. His molten gold eyes were locked exclusively on the pale, radiant face of the woman who had endured unimaginable suffering in absolute silence for his sake. He reached out with both of his massive, heavily scarred hands, gently taking her small, delicate fingers and pressing them against his forehead in a gesture of absolute total submission. For 119 days, I was blind to the miracle standing in the shadows of my own room, the king rasped, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the silent crowd, thick with a raw, desperate remorse. I let you scrub these freezing stone floors. I let you endure the terror of my feral madness, and when you needed me most, when they dragged you and our unborn child out into the freezing gales, my body was a tomb. Inside I was man watching his own heart being torn out of his chest, completely unable to protect you. Evelina's breath hitched. She could feel the violent trembling in his broad shoulders, the immense, crushing weight of the guilt he had carried through the snow-covered pine forests. You did not fail me, she whispered, her voice a soft, steady melody that cut through the ancient gloom of the fortress. She stepped closer, letting the golden warmth of her sunborn magic flow down her arms and wrap around his shivering, kneeling form. You broke a dark curse through sheer willpower to find me in the storm. You bled for me, you fought for me. Some wounds could only be healed with love, Kenneth, and I would rather burn with you than freeze alone in the dark. The king let out a ragged, shuddering breath, turning his face to press a desperately tender kiss to the inside of her wrist. He slowly rose to his feet, his towering frame dwarfing her, yet every micro-movement he made was meticulously designed to show his absolute devotion. He reached out, picking up the heavy, ancient golden circlet from the velvet cushion where Cassandra had left it. He did not place it on his own head. Instead, with a reverence reserved for deities, he stepped behind Evelina and gently lowered the ancient gold onto her soft, dark hair. Not used, not owned, chosen. The moment the enchanted metal touched her, it reacted violently to the liquid silver magic of the lichen air and the golden fire of her sunborn blood. The crown did not just sit on her head, It bonded with her, emitting a blinding, radiant light that instantly banished every lingering shadow in the royal sanctum. The permanent, bone-deep chill that had plagued the black stone corridors for centuries was suddenly, irreversibly swept away by a wave of pure summer warmth. "Behold your true Luna," the monarch roared, his voice echoing with the triumphant, earth-shattering power of a fully restored kingdom. "The savior of Waitress, the mother of the royal line. Anyone who does not bow will answer to my claws." He did not need to issue the threat. As Evelina turned to face the crowd, her eyes shining with unshed tears and her skin radiating a gentle absolute authority, the entire assembly fell to their knees. It was not out of terror, but out of genuine, profound reverence. They bowed to the quiet maid who had endured the ice and returned as a god. In the weeks that followed the coronation, Kenneth refused to let Evelina out of his sight. The Alpha King personally oversaw the transformation of the fortress, actively tearing down the drafty, oppressive stones of the royal wing to build a secure, impenetrable sanctuary for his mate. He spent every evening wrapping her in thick, heated furs, his massive hands gently resting over her swollen stomach, diligently funneling his roaring apex vitality to ensure her final months of pregnancy were entirely shielded from the winter's bite. He became less a warlord and more a devoted guardian, building a warm, sunlit haven where no shadows could ever reach them. Months later, the dark, suffocating memories of the winter fortress felt like nothing more than a distant, faded nightmare. The royal bedchamber had been completely transformed. The heavy, oppressive tapestries and the dark velvet drapes had been torn down, replaced by sheer, airy silks that allowed the bright, warm morning sunlight to flood the room. The air no longer smelled of bitter nightshade and toxic magic. It was rich with the scent of wild honey, fresh pine, and the unmistakable sweet aroma of warm milk. Evelina sat in the center of the massive, custom-built nesting room, leaning back against a mountain of incredibly soft, thick pillows. She was exhausted, her body aching with the profound, lingering fatigue of a grueling labor, but her heart was fuller than she had ever thought possible. Cradled against her chest, wrapped tightly in a soft woolen blanket, was the royal lichen heir. The tiny pup had a shock of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes, they were a brilliant, piercing, unmistakable molten gold. He was perfect. He was safe. The heavy wooden doors of the chamber opened silently. Kenneth stepped into the sanctuary, his massive frame moving with a cautious, devastating gentleness. The terrifying warlord who had slaughtered assassins with his bare hands now carried a simple silver tray bearing a steaming porcelain cup and a plate of warm, honey-drenched pastries. He set the tray down on the bedside table and immediately dropped to his knees beside the bed, his golden eyes entirely consumed by the sight of his mate and his son. He reached out a heavy, scarred finger, lightly tracing the soft, flushed cheek of the sleeping infant before moving to gently cup Evelina's jaw. The blistering heat of his touch was a constant, reassuring anchor, a physical manifestation of his eternal vow. "You should be resting, my Luna," the king murmured, his voice a low, vibrating purr that made the baby stir happily in his sleep. "The council can wait. The empire can wait. I have brought your tea." Evelina smiled, leaning into his touch, the golden thread of their mate bond humming with a deep, absolute, unshakable peace. She looked at the steaming cup on the tray. It was not poisoned winter rose, nor was it the desperate lunamint she had once used to suppress his madness. It was simply tea, brewed by the hands of a sovereign who had learned that true strength was found in the quiet, unrelenting devotion of a daily act of care. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy of the light. She would never step aside again. They had survived the ice, the betrayal, and the venom, emerging from the dark completely unbroken. The quiet maid who was assigned to wake the monster had not only saved the man beneath the curse, she had awakened the dawn of a new, radiant empire. Thank you for listening to this story. If their journey out of the freezing dark and into the warmth of absolute devotion touched your heart, let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. Did the king's public groveling satisfy your need for justice against the treacherous court? Your thoughts mean more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories of quiet strength, devastating revenge, and unbreakable fated mates, make sure to subscribe to join our pack. Until next time, stay safe and remember that your true worth can never be buried in the snow.